Okay, so this is where we left off with chapter 3. Last time we talked about primary production, and this time we're going to talk about how the energy that's captured from the sun is able to move through trophic levels throughout the ecosystem. So these are all terms you've heard before, but there just might be a few synonyms that you're not familiar with. So for producers and autotrophs, those are really just our plants. And as we covered in the last session, those take energy through either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So photosynthesis is from the sun, and chemosynthesis was from those hydrothermal vents. And they are able to take that energy and turn it into an organic form of energy that can be then used by the next trophic levels that are our consumers. Now we have different levels of consumers, and we'll go over those in more detail on the next slide, but just to introduce it, you're going to have primary, secondary, tertiary, and even sometimes you'll go to a top predator or a quaternary consumer. Our primary consumers are herbivores, and our secondary consumers are either carnivores or what we call omnivores. So our primary consumers only eat plants, and our secondary consumers eat animals. So they're either going to be carnivores or omnivores, meaning they can eat both plants and animals. Now, any ecosystem has to have a decomposer because there's always going to be material that does not get used up. So we have to have some way to cycle those nutrients back into our soils. And decomposition can either be aerobic or anaerobic. Now just remember these terms that aerobic means in the presence of oxygen, which tends to be faster, and anaerobic means without oxygen present. Now some other ones that don't quite fit into these other categories are what we call scavengers. So scavengers are kind of like the cleanup crew. They go back behind and they eat the material that hasn't been finished by our carnivores typically. And our detritivores, those are the ones that go back behind and eat what the herbivores didn't eat. So our detritivores eat decaying plant material. Those are going to be things like insects and earthworms, things like that. Mostly you'll find our detritivores in the soils. Now this is just an example of these different levels of our trophic levels. So our producers, they can be giant like this oak tree, or they can be tiny like these diatoms. Now, one important thing to note is that primary production happens both on land but also in our oceans, and that most of the world's oxygen is produced by phytoplankton in the oceans. So these are diatoms that will photosynthesize in the top 100 feet or so of the ocean. Our herbivores, they can be giant like giraffes or tiny like insects. So here what I'm just trying to get you to see is that size is not significant here, that you can have large and small examples of both. Our carnivores can be like our top predatory birds, or there's also lots of predatory insects. And then our decomposers, mostly they'll fall into the category of either fungus or bacteria. So here's just another example. This would be a food chain that you start down here at the bottom with our producers. So both we have plants on land and our phytoplankton in the oceans. And then our primary consumers, these are going to be our herbivores. So our herbivores will be ones that only eat producers. They don't eat anything else. Our secondary consumers eat primary consumers. But if they're an omnivore, they might also eat plants. So you will always put an organism at the highest level of the food chain that they can sit on. Our tertiary consumers will be ones that eat secondary consumers, and then our quaternary consumers will be ones that eat our tertiary. So we just have an ordinal number as we go up. Now just to throw in another term here that you should remember from biology is that our autotrophs are a synonym for our primary producers, which is a synonym for plants. And our heterotrophs are a synonym for our consumers. So remember that troph here means feeding level. So auto means they feed themselves. So primary producers feed themselves through energy either from the sun for photosynthesis or the Earth's crust for chemosynthesis. And heterotrophs means that they cannot make their own food. So they have to consume their own food. Now, that showed a food chain where one thing eats another thing eats another thing, but that's not really a good representation of what happens in nature, because in nature things are so interconnected. So for instance, if you take a look at this guy right here, at krill right in the center, we can see that he is food for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 animals in this food web. Now, if you were to just take one food chain out of this food web, you might take light to phytoplankton, to krill, to squid, to a sperm whale. And that doesn't really show the importance that krill plays in this entire food web. So when you take this krill out, this entire food web could collapse. Now what we'll see later on is that could be something that we refer to as a keystone species, somebody who has a really key role in the functioning of that ecosystem. So a food web shows the interconnected relationships between animals and how food chains can overlap and interconnect. So it really shows the complexity of nature. Now, it would not be unusual for you to have to draw a food web on your AP test. And one of the things that you always have to remember is that there are arrows, not lines. They're not connected by lines, they're connected by arrows. And the arrows show where the energy is going to. Okay, so the arrow points to who is eating that food. So I have an acronym that helps us, and our acronym is APES. That A is arrow, P is point, and then I have to add in a 2, and then eaters. So APES. Arrows point to eaters. So that's how I always remember. So the arrows actually are really, really key here. That you have to remember to show that flow of energy, because that's really what the arrows are showing. It's showing where the energy is going. It's not really so much what eats what. It's the arrows flow the energy. Okay, so always make sure you put those arrows in the right way. Now, as that energy is moving through our food chain, nothing is ever 100%. Now, if you remember your rules of thermodynamics, it's that energy is neither created nor destroyed, but our second law of thermodynamics tells us that every time you use energy, it becomes less usable. So there's no 100% transfer of energy because of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, one of the most inefficient steps ever in their food chain is actually capturing energy from the sun. That the ultimate source for photosynthesis is the sun, but of all the energy from the sun, plants only use about 1 to 5% of that. So it's a very inefficient process. Most of it is lost to heat. Now predators, none of them are 100% efficient. So what we go by is what's known as the 10% rule. That for, and typically this is either for energy or biomass. So how much energy is transferred in the amount of joules, or biomass, how much weight of living things. So here's a biomass example. That I have a field of 100 kilograms of clover. What that amount of clover can support is 10 kilograms of rabbits, so about 10 rabbits. And what that can support is about 1 kilogram of fox. So that's probably actually less than a fox, maybe half a fox. So 10% of that biomass is transferred up. Now, the reason why only 10% transfers at every step of the food chain is because we use that energy for stuff. So we take in food, and then our body has to maintain our body temperature, has to go through metabolism, we have to move, we have to avoid being food, we have to find our food. So all of life's processes, they have that waste product of heat. Because remember that no energy transfer is ever going to be 100%. So we're always going to lose energy in the form of heat. Also lose energy in the form of waste. And so the available energy that's available to the next trophic level, that tends to be about 10%. So you have different ways of representing this. This is a energy pyramid. And this one is showing joules of energy. That for all the energy that our producers create, this African habitat here. So 10,000 joules of producer, so that's how much energy is produced by plants. So that's going to be our net primary production. What is available to our primary consumers is only 1,000 joules, because they are going to be wasting some of that energy. So the primary consumers get about 1,000 joules of that energy, and 100 joules is available for our secondary consumers. So whenever you have a typical food chain, what you tend to see is that your numbers always have to get smaller up at the top. You can't have an inverted pyramid here because we always have to have smaller numbers of our top predators because energy is lost every step of the way. So this is why you don't have a lot of lions, you don't have a lot of tigers, because there are top predators. Because just thermodynamics wise, you cannot have the energy within an ecosystem to support a large number of our top predators. That's also why our producers always have to be the largest amount in any ecosystem, because so much energy is lost from producers to our primary consumers. So one thing that's always kind of thrown out to kind of pull us back to our human population problem is that eating lower on the food chain would make our energy more available, and we would have more food available because we are kind of way up here. So very, very tiny up here at the top of our food chain. And so eating lower on the food chain will encourage less energy loss and have more raw food and energy available for us. So this might be a good idea for you to practice a little bit, to play around with this 10% rule, being able to place things appropriately on a food web. So I've got a website here, and I'll pull this up in a second to show you. And there's also a PDF, and I'll post this on our Google Classroom. But what this will do is it will allow you to play around with our food pyramids. Okay, so you can either do it in numbers of organisms or you can do it in energy. Okay, so you're going to click on these guys and pull them down and place them appropriately, and you can check yourself. So this would be how many producers you would have, and you would place all these animals, and it won't let you move forward if you haven't done it correctly. There's a field guide down here if you want to kind of research which ones eat what, but it's just a good way to practice placing your organisms on a food chain, essentially. But then also you're going to start to get a look at how much energy and how much numbers. So our 10% rule should be very clearly illustrated in this. So it's just a little bit of practice to help you. So we will take any kinds of questions on this next week, and I hope this is a good review from things you learned from biology. And I will see you soon.